Have you ever done the right thing and watched it destroy your life anyway? Ethan Cole drove his drunk boss home from a company gala, stayed on her couch to make sure she was safe, and kept every boundary a decent man should. But when Claire Ashford woke up confused and asked him one question in front of a live executive meeting, his entire world collapsed in seconds. Single dad. Suspended without pay, daughter sick at home, rent due in 2 weeks, and a rumor spreading faster than the truth ever could. This is not a story about what happened that night. This is about what happens when integrity costs you everything, and the system decides optics matter more than evidence. If you have ever been punished for doing what was right, you need to hear how this ends. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. To understand how a good man ends up accused of the worst thing imaginable, you have to rewind 12 hours. Back to when the night still felt like it belonged to other people's problems. The Ashford Systems Anniversary Gala was held at the Fairmont Olympic, one of those downtown Seattle hotels where the chandeliers cost more than most people make in a year. The ballroom glowed amber and gold, filled with tech executives in tailored suits and engineers in slightly uncomfortable formal wear, all of them drinking champagne they didn't pay for and laughing at jokes that weren't quite funny enough to deserve it. Claire Ashford stood on stage under a spotlight that made her look both powerful and impossibly alone, delivering a speech about innovation and legacy and the future her father had built before cancer took him 18 months ago. Ethan Cole stood near the service entrance with the other company drivers wearing the same black suit he wore to every formal event that required one. He was invisible in the way service workers are always invisible at events like this part of the infrastructure rather than the guest list. His phone sat in his palm mostly so he'd look busy rather than awkward. He'd already checked on Lily twice. His neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had sent him a photo an hour ago of Lily asleep on the couch with her stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm, curls spread across a pillow like a dark halo. Ethan had been driving for Ashford Systems for 3 years. It was steady work with decent benefits and a schedule predictable enough that he could plan his life around Lily's needs. Kindergarten pickup at 3:15, dance class on Thursdays, doctor appointments that he never missed. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it let him be the kind of father his daughter deserved, the kind who showed up. He'd driven Claire Ashford exactly 4 times before tonight. Twice to the airport, once to a board meeting across town, once to a medical appointment she didn't want her assistant to know about. She was always polite in the distant way executives are polite to people whose names they may or may not remember. She tipped well. She said, "Thank you." She spent most rides on her phone or laptop working through problems Ethan would never understand, because they lived in entirely different worlds. His phone buzzed in his hand just as the speeches were ending and the live band was starting up. Unknown number. But the caller ID read CEO Direct Line, which meant the system recognized it even if Ethan's phone didn't have it saved. He stepped into the hallway and answered. Ethan speaking. The voice on the other end was thin and tight, like someone holding themselves together with wire. "I need a ride, now. No security, no assistant, just you." Ethan didn't ask questions. He heard something in her voice that made questions feel dangerous. "I'm on my way." He moved through the hotel with the kind of purposeful invisibility he'd perfected, nodding at staff who recognized the uniform taking the service elevator down to the garage. The company car was a black Audi sedan, clean and anonymous, the kind of vehicle designed not to be remembered. He pulled it around to the valet circle and waited with the engine running. Claire appeared in the glass doors 10 minutes later, moving carefully like someone testing the stability of the ground beneath them. She was still wearing the dress from the stage, deep blue silk that caught the light, but something about her had collapsed inward. Her smile was gone. Her posture was different. She looked like someone who'd been holding her breath for hours, and finally reached a place where she could let it out. The valet moved toward her, but Ethan was faster, stepping out and opening the rear door in one smooth motion. Claire stumbled slightly at the curb, and Ethan caught her elbow, not her waist, not her arm, just enough contact to steady her without assuming intimacy. She smelled like wine and expensive perfume, and something underneath that might have been fear or exhaustion or both. "Thank you," she said quietly. The valet handed Ethan a keycard in a small envelope with Claire's building address printed on it. The look the valet gave him was brief but clear. Good luck. Ethan closed her door, returned to the driver's seat, and pulled into Seattle traffic. Rain had started the kind of fine mist that made the city look like it was dissolving at the edges. Streetlights blurred into smears of gold and red. The car was silent except for the hum of tires on wet pavement. Claire sat in the back, staring out the window. Ethan kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut, which was something he'd learned early in this job. People didn't hire drivers because they wanted conversation. They hired drivers because they wanted a space where they didn't have to perform. But then Claire spoke, and her voice was different than it had been on stage. Softer. Sadder. More real. "My dad would have hated tonight." Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. Her reflection looked small against the dark glass. He would have called it performance art. All those people pretending they cared about the mission when really they just want to know if their stock options are going to make them rich. Ethan didn't offer an opinion. He didn't tell her she was wrong or right. He just drove and let her words sit in the space between them. "You don't have to perform in here," he said finally. Claire let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for years. They drove in silence after that, winding through downtown streets slick with rain, past Pike Place Market shuttered for the night, past office towers lit up like vertical cities. Claire's building was in Belltown, one of those new glass towers where every unit cost more than Ethan would make in a decade. The lobby was all marble and recessed lighting designed to make residents feel like they'd ascended to a different altitude of existence. Ethan pulled up to the entrance, and a doorman in a long coat stepped forward with an umbrella. But when Claire tried to open her door, her hands fumbled with the handle like the mechanism had changed shape. Ethan got out, opened it for her, and offered his hand. She took it, holding on a second longer than necessary. Inside the lobby, Claire moved toward the elevator bank, and then stopped staring at the keycard reader like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her hand kept moving towards the slot and missing the card sliding past the sensor at odd angles. Ethan watched for a moment, then stepped forward carefully. "May I?" Claire handed him the card without looking at him. Ethan swiped it once, smooth and sure, and the elevator doors opened. He stepped back to let her enter, but she turned toward him instead, eyes unfocused. "Which floor?" 22. Ethan pressed the button and stepped back into the lobby. The doors started to close. Then Claire's hand shot out and stopped them. "Don't leave." The words came out raw and unguarded, the kind of vulnerability that costs something to reveal. Ethan's instinct was to reassure her and step away to maintain the professional distance that kept his job safe and his life uncomplicated. But he looked at her standing in that elevator barefoot now because she'd slipped off her heels somewhere between the car and the lobby, and he saw someone who was scared and alone and asking for help in the only way she knew how. He thought about Lily, about the nights when she'd wake up from bad dreams and call for him, and how he'd sit outside her door in the hallway until her breathing went soft and even again, about how being present for someone who needed you wasn't complicated. It was just human. "I'll make sure you get inside safely," he said. The elevator rose in silence. Claire leaned against the wall with her eyes closed. When the doors opened on the 22nd floor, Ethan let her lead the way down a hallway lined with abstract art and recessed lighting. She got the door open on the second try and stepped inside, then turned and looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. The apartment was exactly what Ethan expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Furniture that looked like sculpture. White leather and glass and stone. The kind of space designed by people who thought comfort meant aesthetics rather than warmth. Claire moved toward the kitchen and gripped the counter, swaying slightly. Ethan scanned the space quickly, found the glasses, filled one with water from the refrigerator dispenser. He found aspirin in a bathroom cabinet and brought both to where she stood. "Drink this, all of it, take 2 of these." Claire obeyed like a child, following instructions, drinking the water in long, steady pulls. "You should lie down," Ethan said. Claire turned toward the bedroom hallway and took 3 steps before her legs betrayed her. Ethan moved fast, catching her before she could fall, one arm around her shoulders, careful and controlled. He walked her to the bedroom door and stopped at the threshold like it was a border he wouldn't cross without explicit permission. "Can you make it from here?" Claire nodded, moving carefully toward the bed. She sat on the edge of it and put her face in her hands. "Don't leave." The words again, quieter this time, almost a whisper. Ethan looked at the doorway, at the hallway beyond, at the front door 30 feet away. He thought about the keycard in his pocket, about the car waiting downstairs, about how easy it would be to slip out and pretend this night had never extended past the lobby. But he also thought about Lily asking him to stay until she fell asleep, about how fear doesn't listen to logic, about how sometimes the right thing is just being present when someone needs you to be. "I'll be right out here," he said, gesturing toward the living room. On the couch, Claire lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but clear enough to hold his gaze. "Promise." Ethan nodded once, certain and steady. "Promise." He closed the bedroom door behind him and returned to the living room. The couch was white leather, firm and cold, clearly designed for looking at rather than sitting on. Ethan took off his jacket, folded it carefully, and set it on the armrest. He slipped off his shoes and lined them up next to the couch. Then he lay down on his back, hands folded on his chest, staring at the ceiling. Rain tapped against the windows. The city glowed beyond the glass, alive and indifferent. Ethan closed his eyes and thought about Lily, asleep in their small apartment across the water in Tacoma, where rent was possible and neighbors knew each other's names. He thought about their routine, about pancakes on Saturday mornings, about the way she'd show him every drawing she made at school, narrating the colors and shapes like they held the secrets of the universe. He thought about the promise he'd made to her the day her mother walked out and never came back. The promise that he would always show up, that he would never leave her wondering where he was or whether he cared. That love wasn't something you said, it was something you did over and over, even when it was hard. Ethan fell asleep on that cold white couch, thinking about his daughter and hoping she was dreaming something beautiful. He woke to rain and glass and silent, stiff-necked and disoriented in a home that wasn't his. And then he heard Claire's voice, sharp and controlled, asking the question that would break everything open. But before that moment arrived and everything collapsed, there had been another morning. A different morning. The morning that taught Ethan Cole exactly who he was and what he was willing to protect. 6 months earlier, their apartment in Tacoma. Early light through thin curtains, the smell of coffee and cinnamon toast. Lily sat at their small kitchen table in pajamas covered in stars, eating cereal with intense concentration. Her curls were wild from sleep, forming a halo around her face that made her look both impossibly young and startlingly wise. Ethan stood at the counter packing her lunch, the same routine he'd perfected over 3 years of single parenthood. Sandwich cut into triangles because she refused to eat rectangles. Apple slices with peanut butter. Juice box. A note folded into a tiny square with a drawing of a heart. "Daddy." "Yeah, kiddo? Why do you drive people around instead of fixing cars like you used to?" Ethan paused, knife hovering over the bread. It was a question she'd asked variations of before, usually when she was working through something bigger than the word suggested. "Because driving has better hours. It means I can pick you up from school every day." Lily considered this, chewing slowly. "Marcus's dad is never home. He says his dad is important." Ethan came to the table and crouched beside her chair so they were eye level. "Do you think I'm not important?" Lily shook her head, hard curls bouncing. "You're the most important. You're always there." Ethan felt something crack open in his chest the way it always did when his daughter said something true and devastating without realizing the weight of it. "That's the job that matters most to me. Being your dad." Lily reached out and touched his cheek with sticky fingers. Promise you'll pick me up after school. Always. The word came out certain and absolute, because with Lily there was no room for maybe. Promises were the architecture of her world, the foundation that let her believe in safety when her mother had taught her early that people could disappear. Ethan kissed her forehead and stood returning to the lunch assembly line. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a turtle, was Lily's latest drawing. A stick figure man with broad shoulders and a cape standing next to a smaller figure with curly hair. Above them, in careful letters Lily had spent an hour perfecting it, read, "My Dad the Hero." Ethan looked at that drawing every morning. It reminded him that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was about showing up, about being steady, about keeping promises to the one person who needed him to be unshakable. He dropped Lily at school with a hug that lasted 3 seconds longer than she wanted, then drove to work in his beat-up 2014 Corolla, a car held together by routine maintenance and stubborn hope. The Ashford Systems garage was climate-controlled and spotless, filled with vehicles that cost more than his annual salary. Ethan changed into his uniform in the staff locker room, checked the day's schedule on his phone, and started his shift. He drove executives to meetings. He waited in parking garages and hotel circles. He kept his eyes forward and his thoughts private. And when he got the call that night to pick up Claire Ashford from a gala, he did what he always did. He showed up. He stayed professional. He kept his promises. He slept on that white leather couch because walking away would have meant abandoning someone who asked for help, and Ethan Cole didn't know how to be that person. Not after promising Lily every morning that the world still had people in it who didn't let go when things got hard. But the world doesn't always reward decency with fairness. Sometimes it punishes you for it. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. And tomorrow morning, when Claire Ashford woke up confused and scared and asked him that question in front of a dozen executives on a video call, Ethan would learn exactly how expensive integrity could be. The disaster happened so fast that Ethan didn't have time to understand it was a disaster until it was already over. One moment, he was standing in Claire's kitchen, hands visible, voice calm, explaining that he'd slept on the couch and nothing else. The next moment, Claire turned and saw her laptop open on the kitchen island, the grid of executive faces frozen in various expressions of shock and calculation, the red recording light glowing like an accusation. She'd left the morning leadership call running. She'd been on camera the entire time. They both had. The call ended with Claire's hand slamming the trackpad, but the silence that followed felt worse than any sound. She stood there in Ethan's shirt-buttoned, wrong hair loose, barefoot on expensive tile, looking at him like he'd become a stranger in the 3 seconds it took for her to realize what had just been broadcast to the company's senior leadership team. Ethan left without another word. He took the elevator down. Alone, walked through the lobby, past a doorman who suddenly found the floor fascinating, and got into the company car that now felt like evidence rather than transportation. His hands shook on the steering wheel. His mind kept replaying the faces on that screen, the ones that looked horrified and the ones that looked pleased, and he couldn't decide which was worse. He drove back to the Ashford Systems garage in South Lake Union and parked in his assigned spot. The garage was mostly empty at 7:30 on a Saturday morning, just a few early arrivals and weekend warriors putting in extra hours to prove their dedication. Ethan sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and tried to figure out what to do next. His phone buzzed. A text from Rico, another driver who'd worked at Ashford for 5 years and knew every piece of company gossip before it became official. The text just said, "Bro, check your work email right now." Ethan's stomach dropped before he even opened the email app. He knew. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew the shape of what was coming. The way you know a storm is coming when the air pressure changes and the light goes strange. The email was from Nina Beckhead of Human Resources. The subject line read immediate suspension pending investigation. Ethan read it twice, then a third time, like the words might rearrange themselves into something different if he just looked long enough. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending an investigation into allegations of professional misconduct. You are not to contact any Ashford Systems employees, enter company property, or discuss this matter on social media or with outside parties. A formal hearing will be scheduled within 10 business days. Failure to comply with these terms may result in immediate termination. The words landed like punches. Suspended without pay. Professional misconduct. Do not contact employees. 10 business days. Ethan opened his banking app with hands that felt numb and clumsy. Checking account balance $512. Rent was due in 2 weeks. $1,500 for their one-bedroom apartment in Tacoma, the place with the leaky bathroom faucet and the neighbor upstairs who played bass at odd hours but also babysat Lily in emergencies. He had maybe 3 weeks of food in the apartment if he stretched it. Lily's health insurance was through his job. Her dental appointment was in 10 days. He sat in that car in that cold garage and felt the future collapse inward, all the careful planning and budgeting and promise-keeping suddenly revealed as fragile as glass. His phone rang. Not a text this time, an actual call. The daycare. He let it go to voicemail, then immediately regretted it and called back. The daycare administrator answered on the first ring, her voice carrying that particular tone of polite concern that people use when they need you to drop everything and come immediately, but don't want to cause panic. "Mr. Cole, we've been trying to reach you. Lily's running a fever. 102 degrees. She's asking for you." Ethan was already moving keys back in the ignition, backing out of the parking spot. "I'm on my way." The daycare was 20 minutes away in Saturday traffic. Ethan made it in 14 braking speed limits he couldn't afford to break, given that he couldn't afford a ticket, but none of that mattered because Lily needed him, and that was the only calculation that counted. She was in the sick room when he arrived, lying on a small cot with a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. Her cheeks were flushed dark against brown skin, and her curls were damp with sweat. She was clutching her lunchbox like a shield, the one with the cartoon giraffes that she'd picked out herself 3 months ago. Daddy. The word came out small and weak, and it broke something in Ethan's chest that he didn't have time to examine. He crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched beside the cot, pressing his palm to her forehead. She was burning up. "Hey kiddo, I've got you. We're going home." He filled out the sign-out sheet with one hand while keeping the other on Lily's shoulder, then lifted her carefully and carried her to the car. She was heavier than she'd been even a month ago, growing faster than he could quite track. But right now she felt impossibly small and fragile in his arms. At home, Ethan set Lily up on the couch with pillows and the weighted blanket she liked, then found the thermometer and the children's Tylenol in the bathroom cabinet. 101.8. He gave her the medicine with water and a handful of crackers because she needed something in her stomach, then wet a washcloth with cool water and laid it across her forehead. Lily's eyes were half closed, but she was watching him with that serious expression she got when she was trying to understand something bigger than herself. "Why did you take so long?" The question landed like an accusation, even though she didn't mean it that way. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch and brushed curls away from her face. "I'm sorry, baby. Work stuff, grown-up stuff." It was the same thing parents always said when they didn't want to explain the complicated, terrible things that happened in the adult world, the things that kids shouldn't have to carry. Lily's hand found his and held on. "You look sad." Ethan tried to smile, but it came out wrong. "Just worried about you." Lily studied him with eyes that were too knowing for 6 years old. "You always say we don't let go of people when it gets hard." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. It was something he'd told her 100 times, usually when she was scared about making friends or worried about him leaving for work. It was the promise that held their whole life together. "We don't let go." "That's right," Ethan said quietly. "So your work, people won't let go of you, right?" Ethan looked at his daughter's flushed face and fever-bright eyes and felt the weight of every promise he'd ever made to her pressing down on his chest. He couldn't lie to her. He'd built their entire relationship on honesty, on being someone she could trust absolutely. But he also couldn't tell her that the people at his work had already let go, that they'd cut him loose without even asking his side of the story, that doing the right thing had somehow become evidence against him. "I'm gonna fight for the truth," he said finally. Lily nodded, like this made perfect sense, then closed her eyes and drifted into the restless half-sleep of fever. Ethan sat beside her and pulled out his phone. He had 17 text messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he opened them. "Did you really sleep with the CEO? Heard you got caught. Bro, that's wild. My cousin works there, said you assaulted her. Dude, respect. You're that driver, right? The one who..." The messages kept coming, a mix of congratulation and condemnation, people treating his life like it was entertainment or gossip or proof of whatever narrative they wanted to believe about the world. Ethan flipped the phone face down on the coffee table and pressed his palms against his eyes. The worst part wasn't the suspension or the money or even the accusation. The worst part was knowing that somewhere out there a story was being written about him without his input, and by the time anyone asked him what actually happened, the story would already be set in concrete. He thought about the video call, about those faces on the screen, about how many of them had already decided what they saw and what it meant, about how footage could be edited and context could be removed and truth could be shaped into whatever version was most convenient for the people with power. Then he remembered something. Cameras. There were cameras everywhere in that building. Garage, elevator, lobby, hallway. Claire's building would have security footage, timestamps, proof. Ethan grabbed his laptop from the bedroom and opened it on the kitchen table, keeping one eye on Lily, dozing on the couch. He logged into his work email knowing he probably wasn't supposed to, but not caring anymore about the rules that hadn't protected him. He composed a message to Nina Beck in HR. No begging, no emotion. Just a professional request backed by the kind of documentation that people couldn't dismiss as easily as they could dismiss a person. Ms. Beck, I am writing to formally request that the investigation include a complete review of all security camera footage from the evening of the gala and the morning after. This includes, but is not limited to, parking garage entrance and exit, hotel valet area vehicle interior cameras, if applicable, Ms. Ashford's building, lobby elevator, and hallway footage. The footage will show that I acted professionally and appropriately at all times. I respectfully request that this evidence be reviewed before any conclusions are reached. Ethan Cole. He read it 3 times, checking for anything that sounded defensive or desperate, then hit send before he could second-guess himself. The email sat in his sent folder like a tiny act of resistance, proof that he wasn't going to disappear quietly just because it would be more convenient for everyone if he did. Lily stirred on the couch, making a small sound of discomfort. Ethan closed the laptop and went to her, checking her temperature again. 101.2. The medicine was working. He adjusted her blanket and sat on the floor beside the couch, his back against the frame, just being present the way he'd promised he always would be. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Rico. "Man, I don't know what happened, but everyone's talking. They're saying you're getting fired. They're saying she's trying to protect you. They're saying you set her up. Everyone's got a version. You okay?" Ethan typed back with one thumb keeping his other hand on Lily's arm. "Not really, but I will be." Rico responded immediately. "You need money. I can spot you till this clears up." The offer made Ethan's throat tight. He thought about refusing, about pride and self-sufficiency and all the things men were supposed to maintain even when they were drowning. Then he thought about Lily and her fever and the rent check that would bounce if he couldn't make the deposit. Maybe. "Let me see how the hearing goes. Thank you." Rico sent back a thumbs-up emoji and then, "You're a good dude. Everyone who actually knows you knows that." But that was the problem, wasn't it? Most people at Ashford Systems didn't actually know him. He was the driver. The single dad who picked up his kid at 3:15. The guy who kept his head down and his mouth shut and did his job without complaint. He wasn't a person with a story. He was a role. And roles were easy to rewrite when it was convenient. Over the next 2 days, while Lily's fever broke and came back and broke again, while Ethan measured out children's Tylenol every 4 hours and watched her sleep with the vigilance of someone who'd already lost too much, the rumors evolved and spread like an infection. His phone kept buzzing with messages from people he barely knew. His social media filled up with friend requests from strangers who wanted a front row seat to the drama. Someone created a hashtag. Someone else made a meme. His face pulled from the company directory showed up on a local gossip site with a headline that made him physically ill. Ashford Systems driver, accused of misconduct with CEO power imbalance or exploitation. The article didn't name him directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone who worked at Ashford knew. Everyone who'd seen that video call knew. The comments section was a war zone of people who'd never met him deciding whether he was a predator or a victim, whether Claire was lying or confused, whether the whole thing was a setup or a scandal, or proof that the system was broken. Ethan read 3 comments before he had to close the browser. He focused on Lily instead. On making her soup she could keep down. On reading her favorite books and the voices she liked. On sitting beside her while she slept watching the rise and fall of her small chest, reminding himself that this was what mattered. Not the opinions of strangers. Not the job that had cut him loose. Just this. Just her. On the 3rd day, Lily's fever broke for good. She woke up clear-headed and hungry, demanding pancakes and asking if she could go back to school. Ethan made the pancakes and told her she needed 1 more day of rest, and she pouted but agreed, which meant she was definitely feeling better. While Lily watched cartoons on the couch wrapped in blankets like a small burrito, Ethan checked his email. There was a response from Nina Beck. He opened it with the kind of dread that came from knowing the answer before the question was asked. Mr. Cole, your request has been noted and will be included in the investigation process. The hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. in Conference Room 12A. You may bring a representative if you choose. Please confirm your attendance. Ethan read it 3 times, looking for something human in the language, some acknowledgement that his life and livelihood were on the line, but there was nothing. Just procedure, just policy, just the machinery of institutional protection grinding forward. He confirmed his attendance in 2 sentences, then closed the laptop. Lily looked over at him from the couch, her eyes bright and clear again. Daddy, can we go to the park when I'm better? Ethan crossed the room and sat beside her, pulling her into his lap even though she was really getting too big for it. Absolutely, wherever you want to go. Lily leaned her head against his chest, and they sat like that in the weak morning light, father and daughter holding on to each other, while the world outside tried to decide what their story meant. Ethan thought about the hearing, about walking into that conference room and facing the people who'd already made up their minds, about the cameras he'd requested and whether anyone would actually look at them, about Claire Ashford and whether she regretted asking him to stay or just regretted getting caught. But mostly he thought about the promise he'd made that morning 6 months ago, standing in their tiny kitchen while Lily ate cereal and asked him why he chose a job that let him pick her up from school every day. That's the job that matters most to me. Being your dad. Everything else could fall apart. The job, the reputation, the careful life he'd built. But that promise was bedrock. That promise was the one thing that couldn't break because Lily needed to believe that someone in this world would always show up for her, would always fight for truth even when it was expensive, would always choose doing right over doing easy. Ethan held his daughter close and prepared himself for a fight he didn't want, but couldn't avoid because walking away would mean teaching her that integrity was optional and promises were negotiable, and he would burn his whole life down before he'd teach her that. The hearing was in 5 days. The rent was due in 12. His bank account was shrinking and his daughter was asking questions he couldn't fully answer. But Ethan Cole had the truth on his side, and security footage that would prove it. And if that wasn't enough to save him, then at least he'd know he'd fought for something real. He kissed the top of Lily's head and let her pick the next cartoon and tried not to think about what would happen if the people with power decided that optics mattered more than evidence, that protecting the institution was more important than protecting the truth. Tuesday arrived with the kind of gray Seattle rain that felt less like weather and more like atmosphere, the city wrapped in mist that made everything look temporary and uncertain. Ethan dropped Lily at school with a hug that lasted long enough for her to squirm and ask if he was okay. He told her he was, which was only half a lie. He was holding together. That would have to be enough. The Ashford Systems campus sat on the edge of Lake Union, all glass and steel and architectural ambition. The kind of building that looked like it was designed to intimidate people who didn't belong there. Ethan had driven past it 1,000 times, had parked in its garage every workday for 3 years, but walking through the front entrance as a suspended employee felt different. He felt exposed, visible in a way he'd never been before. Security recognized him but didn't smile. The receptionist gave him a visitor badge, even though he technically still worked there. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt longer than it should have, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized. He'd worn his only suit again, the one that was tight across the shoulders and slightly too short in the sleeves. His tie was straight. His shoes were polished. He looked like a man trying to prove he deserved to be taken seriously. Conference room 12A was at the end of a long hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than his car. The door was closed. Through the glass panel, Ethan could see 3 people already seated, arranged on one side of a long table, like a tribunal. He stood outside for 10 seconds, gathering himself, then knocked once and entered. The room was designed for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake and the city beyond, rain streaking the glass in patterns that looked almost decorative. The conference table was black glass that reflected the overhead lights like dark water. The chairs were leather and expensive and positioned in a way that made it clear who had power and who didn't. Nina Beck sat in the center, flanked by 2 others. She was in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, wearing a blazer that probably cost what Ethan made in a month. Everything about her suggested precision and control, a woman who'd built a career on managing risk and protecting institutions from the messy humanity of their employees. To her left sat Miles Park, General Counsel, a man in his 50s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look both intelligent and predatory. He wore his authority like a well-tailored suit, comfortable and unquestioned. To Nina's right was Dr. Elaine Brooks, VP of Ethics and Compliance, younger than the other 2, sharp-eyed and watchful. She held a pen like a weapon and a legal pad covered in notes Ethan couldn't read from this distance. Across from them, on the other side of the table, sat a single empty chair. "Mr. Cole," Nina said without standing. "Please sit." Ethan sat. The chair was positioned so that the light from the windows hit him directly, while the 3 executives sat in relative shadow. It felt deliberate. Nina opened a folder on the table in front of her and scanned the contents like she hadn't already memorized every word. "We appreciate you coming in today. This hearing is part of our standard investigation process following allegations of professional misconduct. You are not required to have legal representation, but you have the right to request counsel before we proceed. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Do you wish to have legal representation present?" Ethan thought about the retainer fees he couldn't afford and the bank account balance that kept him awake at night. "No." Nina made a note. Miles Park leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching Ethan with the detached curiosity of someone observing an experiment. "Mr. Cole." Nina began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd had media training on the morning of October 14th. "You were found in CEO Claire Ashford's private residence at approximately 7 a.m. Miss Ashford was partially undressed, and you had spent the night there. Is this accurate?" The phrasing made it sound sordid, made it sound like something it wasn't. Ethan kept his voice level. "I drove Miss Ashford home from the company gala the night before because she called and requested a ride. She was intoxicated. I helped her inside to ensure she was safe, and she asked me not to leave." I slept on her couch. That's what happened. Nina's expression didn't change, and yet you remained overnight in her home, alone, without notifying anyone of your location or the situation. She asked me to stay. She was scared and alone, and I didn't think leaving her in that condition was the right thing to do. Dr. Brooks spoke for the first time, her voice measured and clinical. Mr. Cole, are you aware of the company policy regarding fraternization and appropriate boundaries between employees of different levels? Yes. And you don't believe that spending the night in the CEO's home violates those boundaries? Ethan felt heat rising in his chest but kept his voice controlled. I believe that helping someone who was vulnerable and asked for help is a human response. I maintained appropriate boundaries the entire time. Miles Park leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth and dangerous in its politeness. The problem, Mr. Cole, is that boundaries are defined not just by physical actions, but by perception and context. Even if nothing inappropriate occurred, the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging to the company's reputation. Ethan stared at him. So, I'm being punished for how something looks rather than what actually happened. Nina slid a paper across the table. Ethan recognized it as a printed email. We've received statements from 3 employees alleging that they witnessed inappropriate closeness between you and Ms. Ashford over the past several months. Prolonged conversations. Familiarity that exceeded professional norms. Ethan felt his hands curl into fists under the table. He forced them flat. That's not true. I barely spoke to Ms. Ashford before that night. 4 rides in 3 years. I was her driver, not her friend. Nina's eyes were cold. These are credible employees with no reason to fabricate such accounts. Ethan's voice came out harder than he intended. Did you review the security footage? The question hung in the air. Nina exchanged a glance with Miles Park that lasted less than a second, but told Ethan everything he needed to know. We did review all available footage, Nina said carefully. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, and another pause. This one longer. Dr. Brooks wrote something on her legal pad that Ethan couldn't see. The footage corroborates your version of events, Nina said finally, each word precise and reluctant. You drove Ms. Ashford home. You helped her inside. There is no evidence of physical misconduct. Relief flooded through Ethan so fast it made him dizzy. He exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Then why are we here? Miles Park's voice cut through the moment like a scalpel. Because the footage doesn't change the fact that you remained overnight in her residence. It doesn't change the optics of the situation. It doesn't undo the damage to Miss Ashford's reputation, or the company's standing when senior leadership saw you both on that video call. Ethan stared at them in disbelief. The footage proves I did nothing wrong. It proves you didn't commit assault, Dr. Brooks said quietly. It doesn't prove that your judgment was sound. It doesn't address the appearance of impropriety. Ethan pushed back from the table slightly, his chair scraping against the floor. So truth doesn't matter, just how it looks. Mr. Cole. Nina said, leaning forward with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a difficult child, you need to understand that we operate in a complex environment. Perception shapes reality in ways that Ethan stood abruptly. The 3 executives went still. You're going to punish me for doing the humane thing, for not leaving a vulnerable person alone, for keeping boundaries even when it would have been easier to walk away. His voice was shaking, but he didn't care anymore. I have a daughter who's 6 years old. She asks me every day if people are good or if they're just pretending. And I have to tell her that most people try to do the right thing even when it's hard. But you're teaching me that's a lie. You're teaching me that doing right doesn't matter if it's inconvenient for the people with power. Mr. Cole, sit down. Miles said, his voice sharp with authority. Ethan didn't sit. He looked at each of them in turn. Did any of you ask me what happened before you suspended me? Did anyone call and say, hey, we saw something strange, can you explain? Or did you just decide that protecting the company was more important than protecting the truth? The silence that followed felt like an answer. Nina's jaw tightened. We have procedures. Your procedures almost destroyed my life. I've got $500 in the bank and rent due in a week and a daughter who needs health insurance, and you're sitting here telling me that even though the evidence proves I did nothing wrong, you're still going to punish me because of optics. Mr. Cole, we haven't made a final determination, Dr. Brooks said, and her voice carried something that might have been guilt. This hearing is part of the process. The process, Ethan said bitterly. Right. He started to turn toward the door, exhausted and furious and ready to walk away from all of it, when the conference room door opened. Claire Ashford stood in the doorway. She looked different than she had on that morning 5 days ago. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a navy suit and low heels, but her eyes held something raw and unguarded, something that made everyone in the room go instantly still. This hearing is over, Claire said. Her voice was quiet, but absolute, the kind of authority that didn't need volume to command attention. Nina stood quickly. Ms. Ashford, this is a standard procedure for allegations of... Claire walked into the room and closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. I said it's over. She moved to the table and dropped a folder onto the glass surface. It landed with a soft thump that felt final. I watched the footage. All of it. Garage cameras, lobby security, elevator, hallway, every angle. Ethan Cole acted professionally and appropriately. He helped me when I needed help. He maintained boundaries. He slept on a couch. And the next morning, I accused him in front of a dozen executives because I was confused and scared and trained to protect myself first and ask questions later. She looked at Nina, then Miles, then Brooks. If anyone should be ashamed right now, it's me. And it's this process that nearly destroyed an innocent employee because protecting institutional reputation was more important than protecting the truth. Ms. Ashford Miles began, his voice carrying careful legal caution. There are complexities here that require... Claire's voice cut through his like a blade. He returns to work. Immediately. Full back pay for the suspension period. And anyone who retaliates against him in any form. Anyone who spreads rumors or makes his work environment hostile will be terminated. Are we clear? Nina's face had gone pale. The board may have concerns about... Then the board can discuss those concerns with me directly, Claire said. But this ends now. She turned to Ethan. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not a corporate one. Ethan stood frozen, trying to process the sudden reversal, the way power had just shifted in the room like a door swinging open. You don't have to. I do, Claire said firmly. You did the right thing, and I repaid you with suspicion and accusations. I let my fear override my judgment. That's on me. The room was so quiet, Ethan could hear rain hitting the windows. Nina cleared her throat carefully. We'll prepare the necessary paperwork for Mr. Cole's reinstatement. Today, Claire said, it happens today. She looked at each executive in turn, making sure they understood this wasn't a request. Meeting adjourned. Nina Miles and Dr. Brooks gathered their materials in silence and filed out of the conference room, leaving Claire and Ethan alone with the rain-streaked windows and the truth hanging between them like something fragile. Claire moved to the window and stood looking out at the gray city, her back to Ethan. I spent 3 days reviewing that footage, she said quietly. Frame by frame. Looking for any moment where you crossed a line or took advantage or did anything that would justify what happened to you. She turned to face him. You never did. You were careful. Respectful. You helped me and asked for nothing in return. And I accused you of assault in front of the entire executive team because that's what this world has taught me to do. Protect yourself first. Trust no one. Assume the worst. Ethan's anger had burned out, leaving something heavier in its place. Understanding, maybe. Or just exhaustion. You were scared, he said. I get that. That's not an excuse. No, but it's a reason. Claire studied him with eyes that held a kind of desperate honesty, like she was trying to figure out if he was real or just exceptionally good at performing decency. Why did you stay that night? You could have called security, gotten a female staff member. left a note, and walked away. Any of those options would have protected you. Ethan thought about how to explain something he'd never really put into words before. I have a daughter. She's 6. Sometimes she has nightmares and she calls for me, and I sit outside her door until she falls asleep again. Not in her room, just close enough that she knows she's not alone. He looked at Claire directly. You asked me not to leave. You were scared and vulnerable, and I thought about what I'd want someone to do for my daughter if she needed help. So I stayed. On the couch. With boundaries. Because that felt like the human thing to do. Claire's expression cracked slightly, something raw showing through. I built my career on being untouchable. On never being vulnerable. On never giving anyone ammunition they could use against me. And one night of letting my guard down nearly destroyed someone who did nothing but help me. She moved closer to the table, gripping the edge of it. I'm sorry for the accusation, for not defending you immediately, for letting the system eat you alive while I figured out how to protect my own reputation. Ethan absorbed the apology, feeling the weight of it, the cost of it for someone who probably didn't apologize often or easily. I just want my job back. I want to pick up my daughter from school and pay my rent and not have people whispering about me in hallways. You'll have it, Claire said. All of it. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth. Ethan nodded, suddenly exhausted by the whole ordeal, by the days of fear and uncertainty and rage at a system that valued appearance over evidence. Thank you. Claire straightened, sliding back into CEO posture, but something in her eyes remained softer than before. I meant what I said in there. Anyone retaliates, anyone makes this harder for you, they're gone. You have my word. Ethan believed her. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she held herself, like someone who'd just drawn a line she had no intention of crossing back over. They stood in that conference room with rain falling beyond the glass, and the city stretched out below them, two people who'd been strangers a week ago, and were now bound together by scandal and truth, and the messy reality of trying to do right in a world that didn't always reward it. I should go, Ethan said finally. Pick up Lily, tell her things are okay now. Claire nodded. Mr. Cole. Ethan paused at the door. Thank you. For that night. For doing what most people wouldn't have. Ethan looked back at her, this woman who ran a billion-dollar company, and still couldn't quite figure out how to ask for help without it feeling like weakness. You don't have to thank me for basic decency. But you're welcome. He left her standing there and took the elevator down to the lobby. Walked past security, who definitely knew his name. Now stepped out into Seattle rain that felt clean and cold and real. His phone buzzed with a text from Nina Beck saying his reinstatement paperwork would be ready by end of day, and his first shift back was tomorrow morning. Ethan stood on the sidewalk letting rain soak his shoulders, and thought about Lily's question from that morning. She'd been sick, the one that had cut straight through to the truth he'd been trying to protect. So your work people won't let go of you, right? They had let go. Instantly, without question. But then someone with power had grabbed back, had stood in that conference room and said, no, this is wrong, and we're going to make it right. Maybe that was the lesson. Not that the system worked. But that sometimes if you fought hard enough and got lucky enough and someone with authority actually listened, you could force it to bend toward something better. Ethan walked to his car in the visitor parking lot, his cheap suit soaked through, and allowed himself to feel the relief he'd been holding back for 5 days. His job was back, his paycheck was back, Lily's health insurance was back, the rent would get paid. But more than that, the truth had won. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost, but it had won. He drove to Lily's school early and waited in the pickup line, watching other parents arrive in nice cars with easy smiles. People whose lives probably didn't include suspension hearings or accusations that could end everything. He didn't envy them exactly. He just wondered what it felt like to move through the world without constantly calculating the cost of every decision. When Lily came running out of the building with her backpack bouncing and her curls flying, Ethan got out of the car and caught her in a hug that lifted her off the ground. Daddy, you're squeezing too hard. Sorry, kiddo. He set her down, but kept one hand on her shoulder, just needing the reminder of what actually mattered. Lily looked up at him with those two knowing eyes. "You look different. Better different." Lily nodded solemn and certain, like you didn't let go. Ethan swallowed hard and opened the car door for her, helped her into the booster seat that she claimed she was too big for, but that he insisted on anyway because safety mattered more than pride. They drove home through rain and traffic, and Lily told him about her day in the enthusiastic detail that 6-year-olds specialized in, and Ethan listened to every word like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard. Because it was. Because this was the job that mattered. Not driving executives, not navigating corporate politics, just this. Just showing up for the person who needed him to be unshakable. That night after dinner and bath time and stories after Lily was asleep with her stuffed giraffe and her nightlight casting shadows on the ceiling, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He had an email from Claire Ashford. Just 2 sentences. "Your first paycheck will include the suspension period. Thank you for your integrity." Ethan closed the laptop and looked at Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, the stick figure dad with the cape, standing next to the smaller figure with curly hair. My dad, the hero. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd tried to do the right thing and somehow survived the cost of it. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the kind of hero his daughter needed. Not someone who saved the world. Just someone who showed up. Someone who kept promises. Someone who fought for truth even when the system tried to grind him down. Ethan turned off the kitchen light and went to sit outside Lily's door for a while, listening to her breathe, keeping the promise he'd made 1,000 times before. "I'll be right here. I won't let go." And tomorrow, he'd go back to work with his head high and his conscience clear because the truth had won, and his daughter still believed that people could be good even when it was hard. That was worth more than any job. That was worth everything. Ethan returned to work on Wednesday morning with the kind of nervous anticipation that comes from walking back into a space where everyone knows your name for the wrong reasons. He parked in his usual spot in the garage, changed into his uniform in the locker room, and prepared himself for stares and whispers, and the kind of curiosity that feels like judgment wearing a polite mask. What he got instead was an email. It arrived at 7:45 a.m., sent to every employee at Ashford Systems from Claire Ashford herself. The subject line read, "Addressing recent events." Ethan read it standing in the garage with his phone in one hand and his coffee going cold in the other. The email was direct in a way corporate communications rarely were. No euphemisms. No carefully constructed passive voice designed to deflect responsibility. Just truth laid out plain. Claire explained that she had consumed too much alcohol at the anniversary gala, that she had called Ethan Cole a company driver to take her home because she didn't feel safe, that he had helped her inside and stayed at her request, sleeping on the couch and maintaining professional boundaries throughout. That the next morning, confused and disoriented, she had made an accusation on a live video call that was unfounded and unfair. That the company had suspended Ethan without conducting a proper investigation first. That security footage had confirmed his version of events completely. That he had been reinstated with full back pay and an apology. And then the part that made Ethan's throat tight. Ethan Cole acted with integrity and compassion when I was vulnerable. He did exactly what we should all hope someone would do for us or our loved ones in a similar situation. The failure here was not his. It was mine, and it was our systems. I am personally committed to ensuring that this kind of rush to judgment never happens again at Ashford Systems. Any employee who retaliates against Mr. Cole, spreads rumors, or creates a hostile work environment will face immediate termination. That is not a warning. That is a promise. Ethan read it 3 times, then checked the timestamp to make sure it was real. Sent to 12,000 employees, public, permanent, the kind of thing that couldn't be unsent or walked back. His phone buzzed with a text from Rico. "Dude, did you see?" She actually did it. Another text came in from a number he didn't recognize. Then another, then 5 more. People he'd worked with peripherally over the years, people from other departments, even a couple of drivers from the pool who'd barely spoken to him before. The messages weren't uniform, but they carried the same basic sentiment. Respect, apology, relief that the truth had come out. A few even said they were glad he was back. Ethan stood in that garage surrounded by expensive cars and the smell of concrete and motor oil, holding his phone and feeling something shift in his chest. Not vindication exactly. More like the exhale after holding your breath underwater for too long. The pressure released. The air available again. He finished his shift that day driving a VP of engineering to a client meeting in Bellevue, then shuttling a group of interns to a team-building event at a bowling alley. The VP didn't mention the email. The interns were too young and self-absorbed to care. It felt normal, in a way Ethan hadn't expected, like maybe the scandal that had consumed his entire world for 5 days was already fading into the background noise of company gossip. On Thursday afternoon, Ethan got a text from Claire Ashford's assistant, asking if he was available for a brief meeting on Friday morning. Not a command, not a summons, a request with the option to decline. Ethan stared at the text for a full minute before responding. Yes, what time works? The assistant replied with a location that surprised him. Not Ashford Systems. Not Claire's office. A coffee shop in Pioneer Square neutral territory, the kind of place where 2 people could talk without the weight of corporate hierarchy pressing down on every word. Friday morning was gray and wet. Typical Seattle autumn, the kind of weather that made the city feel both intimate and isolating. Ethan arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early and ordered drip coffee. He didn't really want, then sat at a table near the window watching people hurry past with umbrellas and their heads down. Claire arrived exactly on time, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of a suit, her hair down instead of pulled back. She looked younger this way, more uncertain, like she'd stepped outside the armor of CEO presentation and wasn't quite sure how to move without it. She ordered something complicated at the counter, then joined Ethan at the table. Rain streaked the window beside them. The coffee shop smelled like espresso and wet wool. "Thank you for meeting me," Claire said. Ethan nodded, waiting. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. "I've been thinking about what happened. Not just the incident itself, but what it revealed about how we operate. How quickly we moved to protect the institution instead of protecting people. How we prioritize optics over truth." She looked at Ethan directly. "I want to make it right. Properly. Not just with an email and back pay, but with structural change." Ethan felt a flicker of unease. Change in corporate environments usually meant committees and initiatives that produced reports no one read. What kind of change? Claire leaned forward slightly. "I want to create a new position. Director of Ethics and Employee Dignity. Someone with actual authority to audit HR decisions, review complaints, enforce anti-retaliation policies, and hold leadership accountable. Someone who reports directly to me and has the power to say no when the system tries to protect itself at the expense of individuals." She paused. "I want you to do it." The words landed like a physical object dropped onto the table between them. Ethan stared at her. "Me. You. I'm a driver. You're someone who understands what it feels like to be powerless in a system designed to protect power. You're someone who did the right thing when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. That's exactly who should be in this role." Ethan sat back, his mind racing through a dozen objections simultaneously. "They'll say I slept my way into it. They'll say you're paying me off to keep quiet. They'll say I'm unqualified." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then we build it so transparent it can't be questioned. Written job description. Posted internally. Your qualifications include lived experience with the system's failures and a demonstrated commitment to integrity under pressure. We document everything. We make it bulletproof." She slid a folder across the table. Ethan opened it. Inside was a job description, a salary figure that made his vision blur slightly, benefits that included health insurance and a retirement plan, and enough stability that he wouldn't lie awake calculating grocery budgets. There was an organizational chart showing the position reporting directly to the CEO with dotted lines to HR and legal but independence from both. "This is real," Ethan said quietly. "This is real. Why me? You could hire someone with a law degree, someone who knows the system, because people with law degrees know how to work within the system. I need someone willing to break it when it's protecting the wrong things." Ethan looked at the numbers again. The salary, the title, director. He thought about Lily and the rent checks, and the nights he'd stayed awake trying to figure out how to stretch $500 across 2 weeks. He thought about dignity and stability and the ability to plan more than a month ahead. And then he thought about the video call, the faces watching him and Claire in that moment, the speed with which people had been willing to believe the worst because it was easier than asking questions. "Let me think about it." Claire nodded like she'd expected this. "Take the weekend." "But Ethan, this is a real offer. I'm not trying to buy your silence or assuage my guilt. I'm trying to build something better." Ethan took the folder and left the coffee shop walking through Seattle rain with his cheap jacket soaked through and his mind spinning with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. That night, after Lily was asleep, Ethan called Rico. They'd been friends since Ethan's first week at Ashford, bonding over terrible garage coffee and the shared experience of being invisible to the people they drove. Rico listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was unlike him, and meant he understood this was serious. When Ethan finished, Rico was quiet for a long moment. "So what's the problem?" "Sounds like a good gig. The problem is, everyone will think I'm there because I have something on her, or because we're sleeping together, or because she feels guilty." Rico made a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "Man, you're scared of being seen." The words hit like a diagnosis Ethan hadn't wanted to hear. "What? You've spent 3 years being invisible, doing your job, keeping your head down, not making waves. It's safe there. Nobody notices you, nobody judges you, nobody expects anything except showing up and driving." Ethan gripped his phone tighter. "That's not a bad thing. It's not. But it's also not the only thing. You're scared that if people really see you, they might decide you're not good enough, that you don't belong, that you're just a single dad with a GED and a 10-year-old car who got lucky." Ethan closed his eyes. "I'm scared of teaching Lily that taking risks doesn't matter, that you can do everything right and still lose everything." Rico's voice softened. "Or you could teach her that sometimes taking risks is exactly how you change everything. That doing the right thing is scary, but worth it. That you don't have to stay small just because someone tried to make you feel that way." Ethan sat with that for a long time after the call ended. He pulled out the folder Claire had given him and read through the job description again, imagining himself in an office instead of a car, wearing business casual instead of a driver's uniform, sitting in meetings where his opinion actually mattered. It felt impossible and terrifying and maybe necessary. On Sunday afternoon, while Lily drew pictures at the kitchen table, Ethan typed out a text to Claire. "I accept. When do I start?" The response came back in under a minute. "Monday. Welcome to the team." Ethan's first day as Director of Ethics and Employee Dignity started with an office that still smelled like fresh paint and new carpet. It was small but real, with a window overlooking the lake and a door that closed, which felt more significant than it probably should have. There was a desk, a computer, a phone with an extension that appeared in the company directory before lunch. His first meeting was with HR. Nina Beck sat across from him in the same conference room where she'd tried to dismantle his life 2 weeks earlier. Miles Park was there too, along with Dr. Elaine Brooks. The dynamic had shifted, but the tension hadn't disappeared. They were being polite in the way people are polite when they're required to cooperate with someone they haven't decided to respect yet. Ethan had prepared for this meeting the way he prepared for everything that mattered. He'd read the employee handbook cover to cover. He'd reviewed 3 years of complaint data that Claire had given him access to. He'd made notes in a composition notebook that now sat open on the table in front of him. He started by acknowledging the awkwardness directly because pretending it didn't exist would only make it worse. I know this is strange. 2 weeks ago, I was on the other side of your investigation. Now, I'm here to work with you to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Nina's expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were calculating. We're committed to supporting this new initiative, she said in a tone that suggested support and cooperation were very different things. Ethan nodded. Good, because we're implementing some changes immediately. He outlined them methodically, keeping his voice level and his language clear. Centralized case logging, so complaints couldn't disappear into individual manager discretion. Mandatory timelines for investigation completion. Written justification required for case closures. Quarterly review by an outside firm to audit patterns and outcomes. Explicit anti-retaliation enforcement with consequences that actually meant something. Nina's polite mask slipped slightly. That will triple our workload. Then we staff properly, Ethan said. Or we admit that protecting employees isn't actually a priority. Miles Park leaned forward, his lawyer instincts engaged. Some of these changes could create legal exposure. If we're documenting everything that creates a paper trail that plaintiffs can subpoena. Ethan looked at him steadily. If we're afraid of documentation because it might reveal problems, then the problem isn't the documentation. It's what we're trying to hide. The room went very quiet. Dr. Brooks spoke carefully, like she was testing the weight of each word. You're proposing significant structural changes based on one incident. Ethan opened his notebook and slid it across the table. Inside were notes from his review of 3 years of complaint data, patterns of dismissal, cases closed without interviews, complaints against senior leaders that went nowhere, employees who filed grievances and left the company within 6 months. It's not one incident, Ethan said. It's a pattern. I'm just the one who had a CEO willing to fight back. The meeting ended with agreements that felt more like ceasefires than cooperation, but Ethan had expected that. Change didn't happen because everyone suddenly agreed it was necessary. Change happened because someone with authority decided to force it through resistance. That afternoon, Ethan got a text from an unknown number. I saw the announcement about your new role. I filed a harassment complaint 2 years ago. HR buried it. If you're real, prove it. The message was unsigned but included a name at the bottom. Tasha and Gwyn. Ethan pulled her file that evening, staying late in his small office with the city lights reflecting off the lake outside. The complaint was there thin and incomplete. Tasha had reported that Jared Voss, VP of Finance, had made repeated inappropriate comments, touched her without consent at a company event, and created a hostile environment that made her dread coming to work. The investigation consisted of one interview with Tasha, one interview with Jared, and a conclusion that the allegations couldn't be substantiated. Case closed in 11 days. Tasha left the company 6 weeks later. Ethan read through the file 3 times, his anger building with each pass. The investigation was a checklist exercise designed to create the appearance of process without any genuine attempt to uncover truth. No witness interviews, no pattern analysis, no follow-up. He opened a new file and started making notes, questions that should have been asked, people who should have been interviewed, documentation that should have been reviewed. On Tuesday morning, Ethan called Tasha. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice wary. "This is Ethan Cole. I got your message." Silence then. "Are you actually going to do something? Or is this just more PR?" "I'm going to do something, but I need you to tell me everything. All of it. Even the parts you didn't include in the original complaint." They talked for an hour. Tasha had kept records. Screenshots of messages. Emails with timestamps. Names of other women who'd experienced similar treatment from Jared Voss but hadn't filed complaints because they'd watched what happened to Tasha and learned the lesson the system was teaching. By Wednesday, Ethan had talked to 4 other women. Not all of them still worked at Ashford. One had moved to another company specifically to get away from Jared. Another had switched departments and taken a pay cut to avoid working on his projects. All of them had stories. All of them had stayed silent because speaking up had looked like a faster route to unemployment than to justice. On Thursday, Ethan walked into Claire's office with a file that had grown to 43 pages. "We have a problem," he said. Claire looked up from her laptop, already reading his expression. "Tell me." Ethan laid out the case methodically. The original complaint. The inadequate investigation. The pattern of behavior across multiple employees. The systematic failure to protect people from someone with power and influence. When he finished, Claire's face had gone pale. "Jared Voss has been with this company for 12 years. He reports to the CFO. He has relationships with half the board." "I know," Ethan said. "And that's exactly why this got buried." Claire stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city the way she had that morning in her apartment, like she was trying to find clarity in the geometry of buildings and streets. "If we move on this, we're going to war with people who've protected him for over a decade. If we don't move on this," Ethan said quietly, "then everything I'm supposed to be doing here is just theater." Claire turned back to face him. "What do you need?" "Authority to place him on leave immediately. Access to his communications. Permission to bring in outside investigators. And protection for the witnesses who are finally willing to talk." Claire reached for her phone. "You have all of it. Start today." By Friday afternoon, Jared Voss was on paid administrative leave and the investigation was underway. Ethan brought in an external firm that specialized in workplace misconduct. The kind of people who understood that truth usually lived in the spaces between what was officially documented and what actually happened. The witnesses started talking. Slowly, at first, testing whether this time would be different, whether speaking up would lead to protection or retaliation. Ethan met with each one personally in confidential settings with assurances backed by Claire's authority that their jobs were safe and their stories mattered. The evidence built. Messages that were inappropriate. Comments that created hostile environments. Touching that crossed lines. A pattern of behavior that had been visible to anyone willing to look, but had been ignored by everyone with the power to do something about it. On Monday of the following week, Ethan received an email from Derek Barnes, chair of the board of directors, requesting a meeting to discuss the ongoing investigation into a senior executive. The tone was formal, but the subtext was clear. The board was watching now, and they weren't happy that someone they'd protected for years was suddenly facing consequences. Ethan printed the email and walked it to Claire's office. She read it once, then looked at him. "They're going to try to shut this down." "I know. Are you ready for that fight?" Ethan thought about Tasha's voice on the phone, quiet and brittle, asking if he was real or just more PR. He thought about the other women who'd stayed silent because the system had taught them that speaking up only hurt the person speaking. He thought about Lily and the question she'd ask someday about what her father did when doing the right thing got expensive. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." Claire nodded once, certain and resolved. "Then let's give them a fight they won't forget." The boardroom occupied the entire top floor of Ashford Systems, a space designed to remind everyone who entered it that power lived here in polished wood and leather chairs and windows that framed the city like it was something the people in this room owned. Ethan had never been to the top floor before. Drivers didn't come up here. The elevator required special access. The receptionist outside gave him a look that suggested his presence was unexpected and possibly concerning. Derek Barnes sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, silver-haired and imposing in the way men become when they've spent decades making decisions that moved millions of dollars and affected thousands of lives without ever having to see the human cost up close. Around him sat 8 other board members, a mix of tech veterans and financial strategists and people who'd built empires and now guided others in building theirs. Claire sat to Barnes's right, the only woman in the room, her posture perfect and her expression unreadable. Ethan took the empty seat across from Jared Voss and his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit who looked like she specialized in making problems disappear through a combination of legal maneuvering and strategic intimidation. Barnes opened the meeting with the kind of preamble that sounded reasonable, but was designed to frame everything that followed in a particular light. We're here to review the investigation into allegations against Jared Voss, a valued member of our leadership team for over a decade. Mr. Cole, you've been in your current role for less than 3 weeks. We'd like to understand the evidence and the process before any irreversible decisions are made. The implication was clear. Ethan was new. Jared was established. Caution was warranted. Ethan had prepared for this the same way he'd prepared for everything since taking this position. Methodically. Thoroughly. With the understanding that people in power would look for any reason to dismiss evidence that contradicted what they wanted to believe. He opened his laptop and connected it to the room's presentation system. A document appeared on the screen behind him. Clean, professional, devastating. Over the past 2 weeks, I've conducted interviews with 6 current and former employees who've reported inappropriate conduct by Mr. Voss. The pattern spans 4 years and includes unwanted physical contact sexually, explicit comments, retaliation against employees who rejected his advances, and the creation of hostile work environments. He advanced to the next slide. Text messages from Jared to a junior analyst, comments that started as friendly and escalated into explicitly sexual territory. Timestamps, screenshots, context. These messages were sent over a 6-month period to an employee who reported directly to Mr. Voss's department. When she stopped responding, her project assignments were reassigned and her performance review downgraded. Jared's attorney leaned forward, her voice sharp and controlled. Context matters, Mr. Cole. Text messages between adults can be misinterpreted. Banter that seems inappropriate in hindsight doesn't constitute harassment. Ethan advanced to the next slide. An email chain where the same employee had asked to be moved to a different project. The request was denied by Jared personally, with the explanation that her skills were needed where she was. 3 weeks later, she left the company. She asked to be moved because of his behavior, Ethan said calmly. She was told no. She left rather than continue working in that environment. That's not misinterpretation. That's retaliation. Another board member, a man in his 60s with the kind of tan that came from golf courses and vacation homes, spoke up with practiced skepticism. Mr. Cole, you've been here 3 weeks. You're asking us to terminate a VP based on complaints from employees who waited years to come forward. That timing seems convenient. Ethan had expected this too. They waited because they saw what happened to Tasha Nguyen 2 years ago. She filed a complaint. HR conducted a minimal investigation. The case was closed in 11 days. She left the company 6 weeks later. The system taught them that speaking up was more dangerous than staying silent. He advanced to another slide. The original complaint file. The investigation summary. The inadequate witness list. The conclusion that felt predetermined. This is what happens when protecting powerful people becomes more important than protecting vulnerable ones. The process exists, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because people like Mr. Voss have relationships with people like you. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Barnes's voice carried warning. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Cole. It's an observation, Ethan corrected. Jared Voss has been protected for years. Not because the evidence wasn't there, because the cost of addressing it felt too high. Jared spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and aggrieved, the tone of a man who'd practiced sounding reasonable under pressure. I've dedicated 12 years to this company. I've mentored dozens of employees. I've built relationships across departments. And now I'm being accused based on what messages that were meant as friendly complaints from disgruntled employees who didn't advance as quickly as they wanted. Ethan looked at him directly. 6 women. 4 years. Documented pattern. This isn't about ambition or misunderstanding. This is about abuse of power. Jared's attorney interjected smoothly. alleged abuse of power. And we'd like to point out that Mr. Cole himself was recently involved in a compromising situation with Ms. Ashford. Some might question whether his judgment in matters of professional boundaries is sufficiently objective. There it was. The attack Ethan had known was coming, but had hoped they'd be smart enough not to deploy. Linking him back to the scandal, making him the story instead of the evidence. Claire's voice cut through the room like a blade. That's out of bounds. Is it? The attorney continued. Mr. Cole spent the night at your residence. He was suspended for professional misconduct. And now, weeks later, he's in a position of authority investigating another employee for similar allegations. The optics are problematic at minimum. Ethan felt heat rising in his chest, but kept his voice level. The security footage from that night was reviewed by HR Legal and Ms. Ashford herself. It showed that I maintained appropriate boundaries. That situation was resolved. This meeting is about Jared Voss's conduct, not mine. But it speaks to judgment. Another board member interjected. You've been here 3 weeks and you're asking us to fire a 12-year veteran. That's aggressive. Some might call it personal. Ethan closed his laptop and looked around the table at faces that had already decided what they believed, at people who'd invested years in protecting someone who'd used his position to harm others, at a system that was working exactly as it was designed to work by making change expensive and consequences negotiable. Let me be clear about something, Ethan said quietly. This isn't personal. This is evidence. 6 witnesses, documented messages, a pattern of behavior that was visible to anyone willing to look. The only thing that's personal here is your relationship with the person accused, which is exactly why these cases get buried. Barnes leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with the kind of calculation that suggested he was deciding whether to negotiate or destroy. Setting a precedent that employees can take down executives based on complaints that may or may not be accurate is expensive, Mr. Cole. Both financially and culturally. It changes the balance of power in ways that could make leadership positions untenable. Ethan heard what Barnes wasn't saying directly. That protecting people like Jared was about more than just Jared. It was about maintaining a hierarchy where executives operated under different rules, where consequences were negotiable, where power insulated you from accountability. So, we should protect the system instead of the people it's supposed to serve. We should be thoughtful about the precedent we're setting. Ethan looked at Claire, then back at Barnes. If that's who we are, he said calmly, then I resign. The words landed in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Several board members exchanged glances. Jared's attorney's eyes narrowed. Claire went very still. Barnes studied Ethan with renewed interest. You'd walk away from a position you've held for 3 weeks, from salary and benefits, and the opportunity to effect change. Ethan thought about Lily's question that morning when he dropped her at school. She'd asked why some people did bad things and other people let them. He told her that sometimes people were scared of losing things that felt important. She'd looked at him with those serious eyes and asked what was more important than doing what was right. He'd told her nothing, and he'd meant it. My daughter is 6 years old, Ethan said. I won't teach her that doing the right thing is optional based on whether it's convenient or expensive. If this board decides that protecting executives is more important than protecting employees from abuse, then I don't want to be part of that system. He stood up, gathering his laptop. The evidence is clear. The pattern is documented. If you choose to ignore it, that's your decision. But it won't be mine. He moved toward the door. Mr. Cole Claire's voice stopped him. The board hasn't made a decision yet. Ethan turned back. Then make one. Because every day Jared Voss stays in his position while witnesses wait to see if telling the truth was worth the risk is another day we're teaching people that this system doesn't actually care about justice. It cares about optics and relationships and protecting power. He left the boardroom and took the elevator down, his heart hammering but his hands steady. He'd meant what he said. He would walk away. The job mattered, but integrity mattered more. and teaching Lily that you didn't compromise on things that were fundamental mattered most of all. He drove to a coffee shop and sat in the parking lot checking his phone every 30 seconds, like the verdict might arrive through some digital channel that would let him know whether the fight had been worth it. An hour passed, then 2. His phone rang just after 3. Claire. He answered. Come back to the office. Her voice gave nothing away. Ethan drove back through Seattle traffic parked in the garage that felt more familiar than the executive floors ever would, and took the elevator to Claire's office. She was standing at the window when he entered, her posture rigid. The board met for an hour after you left, she said without turning around. There was significant debate. Ethan waited. Claire turned to face him. Unanimous vote. Jared Voss is terminated for cause effective immediately. His severance is conditional on a non-disparagement agreement and waiver of any legal claims. Ethan felt his knees go weak. He sat down in the nearest chair before they could give out. They actually did it. They did it because you were willing to walk away. Because you made it clear that this wasn't negotiable. She moved to her desk and slid a folder across to him. Tasha Nguyen's settlement. Full back pay for the period after she left. Formal apology from the company. And we're implementing your proposed ethics system company-wide. Centralized reporting. Outside audits. Real consequences. Ethan opened the folder, scanning documents that represented something he'd almost stopped believing was possible. Actual accountability. Structural change. Justice that wasn't just symbolic. The other witnesses, protected. Anyone who retaliates faces immediate termination, and that policy is now in writing with board approval. Ethan closed the folder and looked at Claire. Why did they change their minds? She smiled slightly, the expression carrying something between pride and exhaustion. Because you called their bluff. They expected you to be grateful for the position, willing to compromise to keep it. When you weren't, when you made it clear you'd rather lose everything than participate in protecting someone who'd abused power, it shifted the calculation. Suddenly, keeping Jared became more expensive than letting him go. Ethan absorbed that understanding that change had come not because the system suddenly decided to be just, but because someone had made injustice more costly than justice. What happens now? Now you keep doing what you were hired to do. Make sure this doesn't happen again. Build something better. Ethan stood steadier now. I need to go pick up Lily. Claire nodded. Go, and Ethan, thank you for not compromising. He left the office and drove to Tacoma with the windows down, despite the cold needing air and space to process what had just happened. He'd walked into that boardroom expecting to lose. He'd been prepared to sacrifice the position to maintain his integrity, and somehow impossibly both things had survived. When he pulled into the school pickup lane, Lily was already waiting, her backpack bigger than her torso, her curls escaping from the ponytail she'd started the day with. She climbed into the car with the energy of someone who'd been waiting all day to tell him everything that had happened in her 6-year-old universe. Daddy. Guess what Marcus said? His dad works at a spaceship place, but I think he's lying because spaceships aren't real yet. And also we had pizza for lunch, and I traded my apple to Sophie for her cookies, which you said not to do, but the cookies were really good. She paused, studying his face. Why are you smiling like that? Ethan realized he was grinning, something he hadn't done in weeks, maybe months. Just had a good day at work, kiddo. Lily considered this seriously. Did you do the right thing even though it was hard? Ethan pulled out of the school lane and headed toward home. Yeah, I did. Lily nodded, like this confirmed something she'd always known about him. Good, because that's the important kind. At home, Lily settled at the kitchen table with crayons and paper, while Ethan started dinner, the kind of simple routine that felt more significant after weeks of uncertainty. Lily drew with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly the way it always did when she was focused. After a while, she held up the drawing. Look, it was a butterfly rendered in the unsteady but confident lines of childhood art. The wings were different colors, purple and blue, and yellow and green, asymmetrical but intentional. At the bottom, Lily had drawn a tiny cape on the butterfly. "That's beautiful," Ethan said. "What made you draw a butterfly?" Lily set the drawing down and picked up another crayon. "Miss Ramirez told us about butterflies in science today. She said they start as caterpillars and then they go in a cocoon, and it's really scary and dark and they don't know what's happening, but then they come out and they're butterflies and they can fly and help the garden grow." She looked up at him, eyes serious. She said sometimes changing is scary, but it makes you able to do things you couldn't do before, like help people. Ethan crouched beside her chair, looking at the drawing with the tiny cape. "That's exactly right, kiddo." Lily tilted her head. "Were you a caterpillar and now you're a butterfly?" Ethan thought about the driver's uniform he'd worn for 3 years. About being invisible and safe and uncomplicated. About the morning he'd woken up on a white couch and watched his life collapse. About the fight he'd just won in a boardroom 40 floors above the city. Maybe. I think maybe I am. Lily picked up the drawing and studied it critically. "I'm going to give this to you for your new office. So you remember that changing is okay." Ethan's throat went tight. He pulled Lily into a hug that she tolerated for exactly 5 seconds, before squirming free to continue her art project. That night, after Lily was asleep with her giraffe and her nightlight and her absolute certainty that the world made sense if you just did the right things, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He drafted an email to Tasha and Gwyn. "The investigation concluded today. Jared Voss has been terminated for cause. The company is offering you a settlement that includes back pay and a formal apology. More importantly, we've implemented new policies to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I know that doesn't undo what happened to you, but I wanted you to know that speaking up mattered. It changed things." He sent it before he could overthink the words, then closed the laptop and looked at Lily's butterfly drawing on the table. The system hadn't fixed itself. One case didn't erase years of protecting powerful people at the expense of vulnerable ones. But it was a crack in the foundation proof that change was possible when someone was willing to fight for it, even when the cost felt too high. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning that felt almost normal, Ethan walked into his office and found a package on his desk. Small, wrapped carefully. Inside was a crystal award shaped like a butterfly mounted on a wooden base. The engraving read, "For choosing courage over comfort. Thank you for teaching us to do better." There was no signature, but Ethan knew it was from Claire. He set it on his shelf next to Lily's drawing, 2 butterflies representing the same truth from different perspectives. Change was possible. Integrity mattered. And sometimes doing the right thing cost you everything except the one thing that actually counted, which was being able to look at yourself and your daughter and know that you hadn't compromised on the things that were fundamental. That afternoon, Claire stopped by his office with a folder. "Latest ethics report," she said, setting it on his desk. "Employee trust scores are up 18%. Complaint reporting is up 32%, which sounds bad until you realize it means people finally believe the system will protect them." Ethan flipped through the report, seeing numbers that represented actual human experiences, people who'd decided that speaking up was worth the risk because someone had proven the system could work. "We're not perfect yet," Claire continued. "We're probably never going to be perfect. But we're better, and that matters." Ethan looked at the butterfly award on his shelf. "It does matter." Claire followed his gaze and smiled slightly. "Your daughter drew that." "Yeah." She said butterflies start in the dark and it's scary, but it makes them able to help the garden. Claire was quiet for a moment. Smart kid. She is. Through the window, Seattle spread out below them, rain-washed and alive. A city full of people trying to navigate systems that didn't always protect them, trying to do right in a world that didn't always reward it. Ethan's office was small and the view was modest and the problems were endless, but for the first time in his adult life he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be doing work that actually mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily's school. "Early dismissal today due to staff training. Can you pick up at 1:30? Ethan checked his calendar. He had a meeting with HR at 2 to review the new complaint protocol. He could reschedule. He typed back, "I'll be there." Then he looked at the butterfly on his shelf at Lily's drawing next to it at the ethics report, showing that change was possible when people refused to accept that the system was too big or too entrenched to move. Outside his window, Seattle rain kept falling. Inside his office, the work continued. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but with something that felt more valuable than perfection, which was progress built on the understanding that people mattered more than process, that truth was worth fighting for even when it was expensive, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to let go of the people and principles that made you who you were. Ethan had started as a driver, invisible and safe and uncomplicated. He'd been accused and suspended and nearly destroyed for doing a decent thing. And through all of it, he'd learned what Lily had tried to tell him from the beginning. We don't let go of people when it gets hard. That was the lesson. That was the foundation. That was what made the difference between systems that protected power and systems that protected people. He picked up his phone and texted Claire, "Meeting at 2 needs to reschedule. School pickup." Her response came back immediately, "Family first." Always. Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator, leaving the butterfly award catching light on his shelf. A reminder that change was possible and courage mattered. And sometimes the hardest transformations led to the most important growth. He drove to Tacoma with rain streaking his windshield and arrived at Lily's school exactly on time, because promises mattered and showing up mattered, and being the kind of father who never made his daughter wonder where he was mattered more than any job or title or position. Lily ran to the car with her backpack bouncing and her smile bright, and Ethan caught her in a hug that lifted her off the ground. "You're early," she said, delighted. "Couldn't miss you," Ethan said. They drove home together through Seattle traffic, father and daughter talking about her day and his work in the easy shorthand of people who knew they could count on each other. And when they got home, Lily showed him another drawing she'd made, this one of 2 butterflies flying together, one big and one small, both with tiny capes. "That's us," she said confidently. "We help the garden." Ethan looked at the drawing and felt something settle in his chest, the final piece of understanding clicking into place. "Yeah, kiddo, that's exactly what we do." Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, they made dinner together and did homework and watched cartoons until bedtime. Just an ordinary evening in an ordinary apartment. But ordinary had never felt so hard-won or so valuable. That night, after Lily was asleep, Ethan sat outside her door the way he always did, listening to her breathe, keeping the promise he'd made 1,000 times before. And tomorrow he'd go back to work and keep fighting for a system that protected people instead of power kept building. Something better. Brick by difficult brick kept teaching Lily through action instead of words that integrity wasn't optional and courage wasn't comfortable, but both were necessary if you wanted to actually make a difference. The butterfly on his shelf would catch the light. The ethics reports would show progress. The complaints would keep coming because people finally believed they'd be heard. And Ethan would show up every day and do the work not because it was easy or comfortable or guaranteed to succeed, but because it was right, because we don't let go of people when it gets hard, because truth matters more than optics, because one person willing to fight can crack a system that seemed unbreakable, and because somewhere in Tacoma, a 6-year-old girl was drawing butterflies with capes and believing that her dad was exactly who he'd promised to be, someone who showed up, who kept his word, who chose the right thing even when it cost everything. That was worth more than any salary, worth more than any title, worth everything. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself believe finally that maybe he'd become exactly what Lily had always seen in him. Not a hero in the dramatic sense, just someone steady and decent who refused to let go when things got hard. A butterfly who'd found his wings. A father who'd kept his promises. A man who'd learned that sometimes the scariest transformations lead to the most meaningful growth. And in the morning he'd wake up and do it all again because that's what mattered. Not the dramatic moments, just the steady showing up, just the daily choice to be someone his daughter could believe in. The rain fell. The city slept. And Ethan Cole sat outside his daughter's door, keeping watch, keeping promises, keeping faith that doing right still mattered in a world that didn't always reward it. It was enough. It was everything.